I always thought loyalty had a weight to it, the kind that settles in your bones after years of carrying a company on your back. For me, that weight was 15 years heavy. 15 years of conference rooms, late nights buried in case law, and phone calls that began with panic and ended with silence once I cleaned up the mess. That morning, I walked into the boardroom expecting another crisis to patch. Instead, I was handed my own execution. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 51 years old, and for the past decade and a half, I served as Chief Corporate Counsel for Halloway International, a manufacturing giant that likes to paint itself in polished blues and whites on television ads, smiling families and green energy slogans. Behind the curtain, it was my job to keep those smiles from collapsing in court. I wasn't glamorous, I wasn't flashy, but I was precise. I prevented 12 major lawsuits, cases that could have stripped this company down to its skeleton. OSHA violations, defective parts, labor disputes that smelled like open fires. I stopped them all before they reached the headlines, which is why the betrayal landed the way it did. The CEO's son, Brandon Halloway, had been given a new title, Vice President of Strategic Development. He'd been in the role less than 3 weeks when he called me into the boardroom. He sat at the head of the table like a boy wearing his father's shoes, and next to him lounged his frat buddy in an expensive suit that still looked rented. Brandon didn't waste time. "Daniel," he said, "we appreciate your years of service, but it's clear you're stuck in the past. We need new blood. Fresh thinking." His smirk was the kind only a man born into wealth can wear, smug, untouchable, hollow. Then he twisted the knife. "Contracts are just pieces of paper," his friend chimed in, leaning back like he'd already claimed the room. "What matters is speed, vision, disruption." He didn't even know how to spell half the statutes I'd bent my life to protect this company from, but his voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never been in a deposition. I sat there in silence, watching Brandon slide the termination letter across the table with his manicured hand. 15 years dissolved into a stack of printed pages. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him that without me, the company would have bled millions in settlements. I didn't point to the glass wall of the boardroom where the skyline glowed like a stage backdrop I had earned the right to stand in front of. I simply picked up the pen, signed my name, and closed the folder. When I stood, I noticed the way Brandon relaxed back into his chair, like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for me to explode. He wanted a scene. He wanted to show his father that he was capable of cutting ties, of being ruthless. Instead, I gave him silence. I placed the pen neatly on the folder, buttoned my jacket, and picked up my briefcase. Walking out, I heard his buddy laugh. "Told you it would be easy." That laugh stayed with me all the way down the elevator. On the surface, I was calm, dignified. But beneath that calm, the cataloging had already begun. Brandon's exact words, the timing of the meeting, the buddy's arrogance, the way they underestimated paper, the very thing I'd weaponized for 15 years. Because paper wasn't just paper to me. It was leverage, memory, a trail no one could erase once it was laid down. I didn't go home that afternoon. I drove past my exit, past the neat suburban houses, and into the city. My briefcase sat beside me, heavier than it looked. Inside weren't just contracts and memos. Inside were copies, shadow files, clauses buried so deep even Brandon's father never knew they existed. Safeguards I'd built, not for them, but for me. I never trusted power to remember loyalty, so I'd prepared for the day power forgot me. Brandon thought firing me was the end. He believed I'd vanish, just another relic cast aside by his vision of speed, and disruption. He thought silence meant surrender. He was wrong. Silence meant I was already preparing. Most people think lawyers work with words, but that's not true. Words are air, fleeting, malleable, forgettable. What I dealt in was permanence. Paper, ink, signatures etched in black that bound men stronger than shackles ever could. For 15 years, I'd been the quiet architect behind Holloway International's survival. Every deal, every vendor contract, every labor agreement passed through my hands. And what left my desk was never just a document. It was a fortress with doors only I knew how to unlock. They called me cautious. Some whispered paranoid. But in the law, discovery is everything. You don't prepare for the battles you see. You prepare for the ones you never imagine. That's why I kept what I called shadow files. Every memo, every deposition draft, every offhand remark from a manager who thought compliance was optional. I kept copies, not in the company's server, not in Brandon's gleaming cloud drives that he bragged about to shareholders. Mine. Private, layered, fireproof. Over the years, I built a second library of truth no one could touch. I remembered the first time. It saved us. A supplier had been bribing our logistics manager to cut corners on safety protocols. When a shipment failed inspection, regulators moved fast, ready to slap us with criminal negligence. On paper, we were doomed. But I had the recorded call, an hour-long drunken confession the manager thought was off the record. I pulled it from my archive, presented it within 48 hours, and turned a death sentence into a fine. The CEO never asked how I got it. He didn't want to know. There were others. A whistleblower who claimed our machinery was failing quality checks. He was right, but I had buried a clause 3 contracts back that forced the manufacturer to assume liability if their components faltered under stress. They ate the costs. We walked clean. Then there was the OSHA case in 2009, when 3 workers fell on the same week, and the union smelled blood. I'd already structured the insurance subclauses, so the payouts triggered faster than arbitration. By the time the union filed, the men's families had settlements and signed waivers. What could have been a headline scandal died in a single paragraph on page 14 of the Times. 12 cases in total, each one a knife aimed at Holloway International's throat. Each one stopped before it cut too deep. And Brandon, the heir with the smirk, never knew. He thought his father's empire thrived on vision, innovation, leadership. He never realized it thrived because I kept it out of the courtroom. Now his frat buddy was unraveling it all in record time. Within days of my exit, I heard whispers. He'd ordered compliance staff to simplify contracts, stripping down the dense clauses I'd woven through every deal. He laughed off indemnities, told teams to sign vendor agreements on verbal promises, dismissed due diligence as bureaucratic fluff. A man like that doesn't see traps until he's already inside one. I didn't stop him. Not yet. I sat in my apartment at night, the blinds drawn, and opened my archive. Row after row of files, digital and physical, locked behind codes only I knew. I read through them the way a soldier cleans his rifle before battle, not because he plans to fire it, but because he knows the day will come. Every clause I'd buried, every recording I'd preserved, every chain of signatures was still there, humming like a live wire. What Brandon didn't understand, and what his friend would never grasp, is that contracts aren't just pieces of paper. They're time bombs. Each one carries a fuse, and if you know where it's hidden, you can decide when to light it. I had 12 of them already proven in battle, and 100 more waiting, silent and patient. So I watched, waited, like a sniper in the tall grass, finger resting just above the trigger. Not paranoid, not desperate, just prepared. Brandon loved cameras. I'd seen him practice his grin in the mirrored walls of the boardroom, that shallow expression of borrowed authority. Within weeks of my departure, he was standing in front of microphones, telling anyone who'd listen that he was streamlining operations. To the untrained ear, it sounded bold, modern, decisive. To me, it sounded like a death sentence wrapped in corporate jargon. Streamlining meant cutting, cutting meant bleeding, and bleeding attracts sharks. I watched as employees were herded into conference rooms and handed stripped-down contracts. The thick binders I once produced, dense with clauses, protections, and cross-references, were replaced by flimsy packets barely 20 pages long. Where I had woven safety nets, Brandon's frat buddy had left holes wide enough to drive a lawsuit through. Workers signed because they had no choice. Some whispered to me afterward, voices low, eyes darting like prey, that knew the predator was still near. Old habits die hard. When things felt dangerous, they still came to me. It didn't take long for vendors to sense the weakness. Deadlines slipped, quality dipped. Corners were cut with the confidence of men who knew they would never be held accountable. The contracts no longer held teeth, and everyone knew it. A supplier missed a shipment of critical components and delivered a late penalty so minor it was laughable. Another downgraded materials without notice. The system I'd spent 15 years reinforcing was unraveling, one thread at a time. Regulators, too, had sharp noses. They began sniffing around sites I had kept airtight. I heard whispers of OSHA agents visiting facilities unannounced, of auditors requesting records Brandon didn't even realize he was required to maintain. He thought streamlining meant cleaning out the past. In truth, he'd tossed away the armor I'd spent years forging. I didn't step into the light. I didn't send angry letters or pen editorials defending my name. Instead, I left breadcrumbs. Quiet, precise breadcrumbs. A redacted memo slipped to an old contact at the labor board. An anonymous packet mailed to a journalist who had once covered our safety innovations. Nothing explosive, nothing that screamed sabotage, just nudges. The kind of nudges that make people start asking questions. Meanwhile, the digital arteries of the company still flowed through systems I had configured long before Brandon could spell indemnity. He thought firing me meant erasing me, but he didn't understand how deeply I had wired myself into the infrastructure. Certain emails, certain reports, they still mirrored to accounts he didn't know existed. I read them at night, my apartment quiet, except for the low hum of the hard drives. Every line was another crack in the foundation. What stung more than arrogance was the personal venom. In interviews, Brandon let my name fall from his lips like a punchline. Daniel Mercer. Good man, but stuck in the past. Dead weight. A relic of the old way he said it with a smirk, reporters laughing along, pens scratching the insult into permanence. 15 years of shielding his father's empire, reduced to a soundbite. I didn't answer. I never would. Dignity isn't defended in headlines. It's defended in the silence before collapse. And collapse was already coming. I could see it in the numbers Brandon didn't bother to check, in the loopholes his frat buddy bragged about closing, but had only widened. I detailed the fragility with the same precision I once used to reinforce it. Revenues masking rising liabilities, compliance reports unsigned, insurance carriers hesitating. It was a house of cards in a storm. I sat with the knowledge, patient. Pressure builds in silence, and I had always been good at waiting. The arrogance of the powerful is predictable. They believe silence means defeat. But silence is a loaded chamber. 3 days later, the first fracture appeared. Building a case is no different from building a trap. You don't lay everything out in the open. You conceal it beneath leaves, dirt, ordinary clutter, until the unsuspecting foot finds it. My archive was more than a vault of secrets. It was a field of traps, each one waiting for the right pressure. When Brandon stripped away the protections I'd put in place, all he really did was expose the beams I had rigged long ago. Now all I had to do was apply pressure, small, precise, deliberate. The first step was choosing what to reveal. Regulators are like hounds. They don't need the entire carcass, just a scrap of flesh to catch the scent. I sent an unsigned package to the labor board, copies of contracts where critical worker protections had been edited out, replaced by vague promises of ongoing review. I didn't scream fraud. I simply let the documents speak. Then, to a contact at the Securities Commission, I slipped fragments of vendor agreements showing supply chains built on sand. Late penalties stripped, liability undefined, risk passed in circles until it vanished entirely. To the untrained eye, they looked incomplete. To a regulator, they looked like an invitation. The frat buddy didn't notice the walls closing in. He strutted into depositions with that same frat house arrogance, smirking at opposing counsel, waving away subpoenas like junk mail. I heard recordings from the stenographer who slipped me a copy, him laughing as he told an investigator that compliance is performance art. That single sentence was enough to make half a dozen agencies salivate. Confidence bled from the company in real time. Vendors began inserting harsher terms into deals, no longer afraid of consequences. Insurance carriers raised premiums, citing structural instability. Employees whispered of audits that never seemed to end. And still Brandon smiled, shaking hands in boardrooms, telling reporters the turbulence was the cost of innovation. Then came the gala, a celebration of his new era, complete with crystal chandeliers, fountains of champagne, and a stage big enough to hold his ego. Brandon basked in the spotlight, his father at his side, expression unreadable. I wasn't on the guest list, but I didn't need to be. I slipped in through the service entrance, moving with the staff, invisible among black suits and white shirts. No one sees the ghost in the room when all eyes are on the king. From the balcony, I watched him speak. His voice rang across the hall, booming with false conviction. He bragged about efficiency, about stripping away what he called legal deadweight, about freeing the company from the shackles of outdated thinking. The audience applauded, blind to the cracks forming beneath their feet. I didn't clap. I stood in the shadows, knowing that by the time the music faded, the documents I'd seeded were already circulating through the bloodstream of courts, agencies, and journalists. The gala was a victory lap on a track that was about to collapse. I didn't approach him. I didn't confront his frat buddy. I didn't need to. The work was already done, the lines already drawn. They had no idea the ground beneath them was wired, every beam weakened, every support compromised. Their arrogance had made them sloppy, and sloppy men never see the end until it's inches from their face. I left the gala without a word, slipping out the same way I came. Outside, the night air was sharp, bracing, almost electric. The city hummed around me, oblivious to what was coming. I walked to my car, opened the briefcase on the passenger seat, and checked the files one last time. Everything was in place. Every regulator had their breadcrumb, every journalist their spark, every agency their fuse. Tomorrow, the door I'd left unlocked would be kicked wide open, and they wouldn't even see me there. The first blow didn't come with a bang. It came with a knock. Regulators arrived at Holloway International headquarters at 9 a.m., sharp, clipboards in hand, subpoenas folded neatly inside leather folders. I imagine Brandon laughed at first. Men like him always do. He probably thought it was a formality, some box-ticking exercise he could charm his way out of. But when one agency leaves and 3 more arrive within the hour, charm stops working. By noon, the marble lobby was a battlefield of badges and briefcases. The lawsuits followed like artillery fire. Labor violations, breach of contract, securities fraud, environmental negligence, each one hit with a force measured not in noise, but in numbers. I'd watched the patterns unravel from my desk at home. Every trap triggered exactly where I'd wired it years ago. Clauses Brandon's frat buddy had called fluff became the blades that cut him open. A missing indemnity here, a severed liability chain there, and suddenly millions of dollars had no shield. The frat buddy walked into his first deposition with the same smirk he'd worn the day he dismissed me. He walked out pale, trembling, his words twisted into perjury, before he even realized the stenographer's pen had nailed him to the wall. The court didn't need to fabricate a rope. He'd wrapped it around his own neck. By the second week, his accounts were frozen, his reputation shredded. He tried to grin through interviews, insisting everything was under control. But the grin slipped when reporters produced documents I'd carefully placed in their hands. He never understood that silence doesn't mean absence. It means patience. Brandon fared worse. Regulators swarmed his office, tearing through the flimsy defenses he'd erected. They asked for compliance records that no longer existed, for safety audits his friend had shredded, for financial disclosures that contradicted themselves line by line. He tried to bluff, raising his voice, pounding the table, calling everyone in the room incompetent. That tactic might have worked on interns. It didn't work on federal investigators. By the time he realized how deep the net was, it was too late. Cameras caught him being led down the courthouse steps in handcuffs. The golden boy shackled in plain view. His smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man finally understanding the gravity of silence. And the father, Harold Halloway, the man I'd protected for 15 years, stood apart, stone-faced. He didn't defend his son. He didn't rage or argue. He just watched the empire collapse with the expression of someone who had always known it wasn't built to last. He never looked for me. Perhaps he suspected. Perhaps he didn't want to know. Either way, his silence was its own confession. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no toasts, no applause. I sat in my apartment, lights low, listening to the news anchors deliver the story piece by piece. Each collapse tied back to the files I had safeguarded, each domino falling in the order I'd set. My name never appeared. That was the point. Victory is cleanest when it leaves no fingerprints. The company didn't just burn. It collapsed into the crater they dug, with their arrogance. For a long time, I sat in the quiet that followed, feeling not triumph, but clarity. Betrayal isn't unique. It repeats itself across boardrooms and bedrooms, offices and nations. Arrogance blinds, betrayal cuts, and silence waits. There will always be men like Brandon, loud, careless, convinced the world owes them permanence. And there will always be men like me, quiet watchers, archivists of truth, ghosts who prepare while others laugh. They thought I was outdated. They mistook silence for weakness. But silence is what buries them.